Imagine someone broke into your bank account and stole a few percent of everything you owned, year after year after year. That's essentially what's been happening to anyone who owns US dollars since the US Federal Reserve was created back in 1913. The US Constitution allows the government to create gold and silver coins in standard weights. And the purpose of this is so that when you trade gold and silver coinage, you already know that the weight is standard. This greatly simplifies commerce, as not everyone has to carry a scale around with him all the time. But the Constitution also allows the government to print proxy paper dollars that can be redeemed for gold and silver coins at any time. The benefit of these proxies is that you don't need to lug around heavy physical metal. But to do things right, according to Scripture, there needs to be a direct one-to-one correspondence between all paper monies issued and physical gold and silver sitting in a government vault. That is, all paper dollars should be backed one-to-one by silver or gold, period. The logic behind this one-to-one backing becomes apparent when we look at a chart of the Consumer Price Index, or the CPI, which tracks inflation. The US dollar's not always been backed one-to-one by gold, but the dollar was backed at least partially by gold from the inception of the American Republic in 1775 until the creation of the Federal Reserve a century ago in 1913. In between those 2 points in time, there essentially was no inflation to speak of. The price of gold was set to $35 an ounce by definition. When paper money is directly tied to gold, consumer prices do not rise, and the price of gold normally does not rise. Silver can fluctuate a little more because it's widely used in manufacturing, and so it's subject more to the price pressures of supply and demand, but the price of gold remains relatively constant. But the thing we need to understand is that inflation, as well as any increases in the Consumer Price Index, are entirely avoidable if the dollar is backed one-to-one by gold. But then notice what happens in the chart beginning a century ago in 1913. The US government gave authority to control the US money supply over to the United States Federal Reserve, the Fed. At this point, we begin to see a slow rise in consumer prices, inflation, resembling what mathematicians would call an exponential curve. This is the kind of curve where the rate of change is relatively flat for a long time, and then it slowly starts to begin to climb upward until, after a while, it becomes almost completely vertical. Now notice how the inflation curve began to accelerate in 1971, in the year when President Nixon officially uncoupled the US dollar from gold. But how did such a thing come to pass? Why did something that was against the Constitution come into being? The answer lies in the creation of the United States Federal Reserve. This name is actually a complete misnomer, and it was probably named this way on purpose. The Federal Reserve is not a U.S. government agency, but rather it's a private consortium of mainly European banking families who are in business to make money. In this case, their business is unconstitutional control of the United States money supply, which allows them to siphon off a percentage of all dollars printed each and every year by charging a rate of interest known as the prime rate. The fact that a European banking cartel is in charge of the United States money supply should tell you something about the electoral process in the United States. But in order to understand where the Fed comes from and how it operates, first we need to travel way back in time, back to the giving of the Torah, or the laws of Moses, in the Midian wilderness of Sinai. The Torah commands us not to charge our brothers what's called usury, or interest. For example, in Leviticus chapter 25, starting in verse 35, we're told, "If one of your brethren becomes poor and falls into poverty among you, then you shall help him like or a sojourner, that he may live with you. Take no usury or interest from him, but fear your Elohim, that your brother may live with you. You shall not lend him your money for usury, nor lend him your food at a profit. I am Yahweh your Elohim, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, to give you the land of Canaan, and to be your Elohim. Ironically, although the Catholic Christians did not believe in keeping the Torah or the laws of Moses, the Christian nations kept this commandment for centuries. They didn't charge other Christians interest. But perhaps even more ironic was that when the Christian pilgrims went up to Jerusalem during the Middle Ages, they were subject to bandits and robbers along the way, and if they happened to take anything of value with them and they got robbed, of course, it was liable to get stolen. In order to combat this problem, the Pope gave an exception to policy to usury, to the Knights Templar, which were basically part of the Pope's army. If you lived in, say, England or France, and you wanted to go up to Jerusalem, then in order to keep from being robbed along the way, you could deposit your money with the Knights Templar at one of their temples, and then they would issue you a specially coded document, which amounted basically to the first medieval system of traveler's checks. Thus, you could go on pilgrimage without being robbed. When the Crusades were over and the Knights Templar were disbanded, suddenly there was a huge financial void into which our Jewish brothers stepped. Our Jewish brothers did not particularly like banking, but they were denied citizenship in most Christian countries. They couldn't own land, and they were prohibited from working in the trades. In some countries, they were even prohibited from doing business in public places. However, the Christian kingships did allow them to work at banking, pawnbrokering, and other so-called lesser forms of work. This arrangement suited everyone better, as banking was financially lucrative, and the Christians felt better about borrowing at interest from Jews rather than borrowing from other Christians. For their part, our Jewish brothers had no issue taking interest from the Gentile Christians, since they did not consider them to be Israelites, and therefore they did not consider them to be their brothers, and therefore they felt that taking usury from them was not prohibited. The Christian kings would also get in on the act. Whenever the Christian kings wanted money, they would demand that the Jews hand over all their banking profits, and then they would generally kick the Jews out of their countries or perhaps stir up some kind of political intrigue against them to cover over the fact that they'd just been robbed. As one might imagine, this didn't cause the Jews to feel any loyalty or love towards the Christian kingships at all, which was one of the reasons the Jews were so quick to embrace Marxism, which promised to overthrow the Christian kingships. The status quo slowly began to change after the Enlightenment of the 1600s. Little by little, Christians began to think of the Jews as real people, and one country after another slowly began to grant the Jews citizenship. Now, the Christian kings could no longer rob the Jewish bankers whenever they needed money to fund their wars. So, whenever the Christian governments needed money for a war or for construction projects or for whatever reason, now they had to take loans from the wealthier Jewish banking families and pay interest. The interest on the war bonds made the Jewish banking families extremely wealthy. And since the Christian nations now had to come to the Jews in order to get money, suddenly the tables were turned. Now it was essentially the Jewish banking families who were effectively in control of the Christian governments, as it is today. This is because Proverbs chapter 22 and verse 7 tells us that the borrower is the servant of the lender, as we read, "The rich rules over the poor, and the borrower is the servant to the lender." We love our Jewish brothers and sisters, and the bankers are not all Jewish, nor are they even in fact all European. However, the fact is that the rich London banking families, such as the Rothschilds and the Warburg families, do not see us as friends. They see us as potential targets from which to make a profit. Since America was born as a Christian nation, these banking families have been seeking to take control of the American government just like the governments of all other nations, by controlling their governments through central banking and charging them usury. If that sounds like anti-Semitic hype, it isn't. In fact, Charles Lindbergh Sr. called the Federal Reserve Creation Act of 1913 the worst legislative crime of the ages, because it subverted effectual control of the U.S. government to a private European banking cartel. He said, "This act," referring to the Federal Reserve Act, "establishes the most gigantic trust on earth. When the President, Woodrow Wilson, signs the bill, the invisible government of the monetary power," referring to the Fed, "will be legalized. The worst legislative crime of the ages is being perpetrated by this banking and currency bill." The Founding Fathers well knew that if control of the nation's money supply was turned over to a private banking cartel, that the private bankers would slowly bleed America to death, and that it would spell literal financial ruin for the American people. Thomas Jefferson put it this way. He said, "If the American people allow private banks, such as the Fed, to control the issue of their money, first by inflation and then by deflation, the banks and the corporations that will grow up around them will deprive the people of their property, and their children will wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered." The saddest part about all this is that whether we realize it or not, we are presently on the receiving end of a literal financial war. It's very real, and the future is predictably disastrous. It will probably spell the financial ruin of many people. Millions could even die because of the collateral effects on the economy. The fact is, there's only limited resources in the world, but as the population always grows, eventually there can only be a shortage of food, water, land, oil, and other resources. Since the elite banking families don't think of us as part of their families, then in their mind, the only logical thing for them to do is to gain control over our money supply and basically bleed us to death. And this is how the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, and not just financially. This is essentially what's been happening over the past 100 years or so, as the United States dollar is now worth approximately 2 cents compared to what it was worth in 1913. And upon that, remember that there is no inflation when the dollar is tied to the gold standard. Let's look at the chart of the Consumer Price Index again, and then compare that exponential growth curve to the chart which shows the collapse of the German Weimar Republic's mark, or their dollar, of the 1920s. The time span's much shorter, but notice the exponential curve is exactly the same. What happened in the German Weimar Republic was very similar to what's happening in the United States today with the quantitative easing program. After World War I, Germany was told to pay war reparations, which had to be repaid in gold. The German economy was already struggling in the aftermath of their defeat, and so in order to repay the loans, they just simply printed more money, like the Fed is doing today. However, when you just print more money, but the actual amount of wealth stays the same, each existing dollar represents less of that wealth. Just for one example, using round numbers to keep things simple, let's suppose you had an ounce of gold and it cost $1,000. If you print twice as much money, each ounce of gold now costs $2,000. If you print 4 times as much money, each ounce of gold now costs $4,000. But the amount of money the Weimar Republic printed was much greater than that. When you devalue your currency in this way by excessive printing, it makes it even harder to collect the taxes needed to repay the war debt. And so the German government kicked the printing program into high gear, just like is being done with QE3. As the exponential curve rose, the German marks became worth less and less and less, until finally no one wanted to accept them in trade for anything, and the German financial system collapsed, and along with it, the Weimar Republic. When their system collapsed, the German people demanded change, and Hitler and his National Socialist or Nazi Party was right there, ready to offer change for them. The situation is highly similar to what we're doing today in the United States with QE1, QE2, and QE3, otherwise known as QE Unlimited. The reason Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke said that QE3 would be unlimited is that they already know how this is going to end. They know this from history. And they're preparing the public for an unlimited amount of money printing. As President Thomas Jefferson said, the bank's plan is to control the issue of our money so as to deprive the people of their property, first by inflation and then by deflation, until the banks and the corporations that grow up around them have made the American people homeless. The reason this is happening is that the American people are unwilling to do what it takes to balance the federal budget. As our nation has turned away from our Creator Yahweh, we've subconsciously come to realize that it's easier to vote for an increase in our national debt than it is simply to pay as we go. We like to think we can get something for nothing, and this is precisely what Benjamin Franklin said would eventually bring down the American Republic. He said, "When the people find they can vote themselves money, that will herald the end of the Republic." Just to illustrate, let's imagine a man named John Q. Public, who decides that instead of saving for a rainy day, like his forefathers did, that he can make his life much easier in the short term by charging everything on credit. So he applies for a bunch of credit cards and runs them all up to the maximum limit. Then, because of his desire to continue living beyond his means, he goes out and gets even more credit cards. He applies for more and more and more cards, but after a while he has to pay more and more money just to pay off the interest on his old credit card debt. Eventually he has to spend all of his income just to pay the interest on his cards. He no longer has money for basics like food and clothing without borrowing money. So eventually he digs himself into such a hole that no one will loan him any more money. And so now he must declare bankruptcy, just as the Weimar Republic did. And this is where the United States is also headed, as evidenced by the recent increases in the national debt and the number of dollars printed. The only possible thing the U.S. people could do to avert a collapse at this point would be to balance the federal budget. But the people have not demanded it. Instead, they fall for debt increase gimmicks like the $1 trillion platinum coin, which only offer us a way to delay or get out of balancing our federal budget. With the debt increasing, the money printing curve is already starting to go vertical, bringing us closer to a Weimar-style collapse. Yet the people are ignorant of what's happening, so much so that they actually breathe a sigh of relief that the Congress has again agreed to delay balancing the federal budget. And in reality, the situation is so far gone at this point that it's already impossible for Uncle Sam to reverse the tide and pay the interest on the debt, even if there was any national will to do so. That's why, barring some kind of intervention from Yahweh, a financial collapse is now basically inevitable. Now, let's apply this same kind of analysis to the price of gold. Just as Yahweh created air for the purpose of breathing, he also created gold and silver as money. You can do other things with air, such as inflate tires, and you can do other things with gold and silver, such as make electronic circuitry. But Yahweh originally created gold and silver for the express purpose of storing value and wealth. And since this is what Yahweh originally created gold and silver for, nothing can ever change that. Gold and silver are inherently desirable as stores of wealth, meaning they're inherently desirable as money. That's their function in life. The price of gold spiked after President Nixon took America off the gold standard in 1971, and the survivalist movement of the Reagan Cold War era in the 1980s fueled other price spikes in gold. Yet if we disregard those spikes and look past them, we should be able to see the same exponential curve underlying the price of gold as we saw in the Consumer Price Index in the first chart, and in the collapse of the Weimar Republic's mark in the second chart. As the number of dollars in print increases, the value of gold must also go up in direct proportion, and this is essentially what's been happening since 1971. As the US gets ready to crank up the printing presses in QE3, also known as QE Unlimited, the only thing guaranteed to keep pace with inflation is gold, and quite possibly silver as well. People who don't believe Yahweh's word believe that money doesn't have to be tied to gold and silver, and yet all can still be well. These kinds of people are called Keynesian economists. This is pronounced Keynesian, like Cain, who slew Abel in the book of Genesis. Keynesian economists are not only ignorant of Yahweh's word, they also typically ignore history. And some of them, like the Rothschilds and Warburg families, have silently declared a financial war against America. Ben Bernanke, who used to espouse the gold standard, seems to be one of these now. President Obama seems to be another. Currencies that are not backed by gold and silver are called fiat currencies, and the average lifespan of a fiat currency is approximately 38 years. Notice, then, that the US dollar was uncoupled from gold some 42 years ago, back in 1971. Thus, the US dollar has already lived 4 years longer than the historical average for fiat currencies. Voltaire said this about fiat currencies like the US dollar and like the German Weimar mark. He said, paper money eventually returns to its intrinsic value, which is zero. At this point, only an act of Yahweh can stop the coming financial crash. Things are too far gone otherwise. This could happen, but I wouldn't count on it. If you have any significant financial assets at all, I would urge you to pray and ask Yahweh if He wants you to safeguard your assets by placing them in physical gold and silver, which you take into your possession. If Yahweh does lead you to purchase them, it would be wise not to advertise the fact. But what if you don't have any finances to speak of? What can you do? In any situation in life, gold or no gold, the most important thing is to be right with our Creator Yahweh. That means doing all you can to help spread His true word. And it also means hearing and obeying His voice. If you don't know what that means, please email us, servants@nazareneisrael.org, and we'll talk about it. After you get right with Yahweh, the next most important thing is to have stores of food and water. If a starving man had to choose between a wheelbarrow full of food on the one hand and a wheelbarrow full of gold on the other, he'd have to go with the wheelbarrow full of food. And you can also store extra food for trading stock. After Yahweh, food, and water come basic survival supplies, including self-protection tools such as firearms and ammunition. Please bear in mind that in any financial crash situation, semi-automatics are likely to be taken away. Please plan and prepare accordingly. Medical supplies are also of extreme value in this kind of an emergency situation. Next comes being right with your community, and then only after all that come physical gold and silver. The financial crash of the Weimar Republic did not end the German people, but it did end democracy in Germany because it opened the door for the extreme left-wing National Socialist Party to come into power, with their lie that they were most interested in providing for the common man. Something similar is a realistic threat for modern-day America, as President Obama's Democrat Party has already effectively embraced the exact same kind of National Socialism. But above all, pray. Yahweh specializes in delivering His people from impossible situations. And in fact, He relishes that almost more than anything else, because not only does it force His people to humble themselves before Him, but it also shows His power and His might. So above all, pray, and do what you hear Yahweh's voice telling you to do. May Yahweh be with us all. And for more information about getting right with Yahweh, visit NazareneIsrael.org. Shalom.